England is left at the end of this war with enormous debts because wars are expensive. Wars are quite expensive. And this is a long-standing thing. England is in the mercantilism, imperial business to make money, not to spend money. So at the end of the war, a war that started in the New World, didn't start in Europe this time, started here, where England had to shell out an enormous amount of resources and troops and money to keep the peace. England feels that the colonials ought to pay their fair share. They ought to do their part in this process. Now, this is going to lead to no end of trouble, as we're going to see in the consequences between both sides. And this gets into differing perspectives on the war's meaning. From the English point of view, as we said, the colonials need to start chipping in more. They need to start being more fully integrated into the empire. And England has just shelled out all this money in this war. England wants to protect its investment. That means greater oversight, greater regulation, greater colonial subordination. From the colonial point of view, they learn very different lessons. The colonials feel, when the war ends, that they had actually fought in the war better than the British. The British military techniques and tactics didn't really work. The colonials felt they had made great sacrifices and contributions. After all, it was colonial towns that were burned, colonial colonists that were murdered. It was atrocities that took place here to, as they saw it, our people, not the British. And they feel they've earned the right to then, as they collaborate in this victory, move onwards into the lands that they've evicted the French from, which is then going to lead to the Peace of Paris and the differing perspectives that we just talked about. Imperial changes. After the war now, moving forward, the first law the British put into place is going to have some enormous consequences. We've already discussed at length how salutary neglect was ending. Salutary neglect is now going to end. England says, we're going to integrate your colonies as a fully vested member of the empire. With that comes rights, but also with that comes responsibilities. And it comes subordinating yourself to an overall greater order of things, giving over your rights and liberties to something bigger than yourself. And the first phase they take in this process is they pass an act called the Proclamation of 1763. Because as we've seen from the maps, this was the French territory. English victory is total. England owns all of this. However, there are still French settlers here. The English aren't going to necessarily exterminate them. And there's still a whole host of Native Americans here that claim this is their lands. England sees a problem. And the problem is, if you continue to have westward expansion by these settlers, inevitably they're going to come in conflict with these Indians that are here, which is going to lead to bloodshed, either extermination or military action. There's going to be a lot of military actions going to take place. That military action was going to require England to then have boots on the ground, large military forces deployed here to either keep the peace or, make sure that things didn't get out of hand. As we just talked about, England is in the business of trying to have this empire to make money, not to spend it. So England's solution is this big thick line here, the Proclamation Line of 1763, which runs along the Appalachian Mountains. And England's proclamation says this: from here on out, this area here is going to be an Indian reserve. These are going to be no settlements by whites west of the Appalachian Mountains. White settlement will be confined to the original colonies and this boundary where it is. The idea being is if there's no expansion, there's no contact equals no violence, no conflict, everybody's happy. Well, the Native Americans are happy, the British government is happy, the colonials are not happy. And you can kind of see why. Linkage, everything happens for a reason. From their point of view, whether you chose to agree with it or not, from their point of view, they had fought and paid for and earned the right to be in that land through the sacrifices of the 7 Years' War, through the lives they'd lost, through the blood they'd shed, through the destruction, loss of property, the kind of trade hardships economically they went through during the war, which was really hard on the colonial economy. They felt they've earned and deserved that. And now England's going to take away what they see as being what they're entitled to. This is going to lead to more problems. Now, we talked about earlier with the boards of trade, when England tried to enforce the anti-smuggling laws, colonials continued to smuggle. England now has an invisible dotted line on a map that says you can't go beyond this. Colonials go beyond it anyway. So you're leading to a gradual erosion, bit by bit without knowing it, of total submission to Crown law. It starts with small things, starts at small scale, but it'll grow and get bigger. That'll be a theme of our next couple lessons. That's just part of the policy. England wants to prevent hostilities. England also wants to regenerate revenue to account for the fantastic war debt they've accumulated through these 7 years. So they passed a whole host of laws, the Sugar Act, Currency, Quartering, and Stamp Act. And all these laws are designed in many ways to have the colonials foot the bill or pay what England considers to be their fair share for membership in this empire. Sugar Act is going to place a tax on sugar. Currency Act is going to forbid the current colonies to print their own paper money. They got to pay for things in gold, which is going to send that gold back to England, generate more revenue, hard currency rather. Quartering Act, colonists are going to help defray the expenses of British postings here in the New World by putting soldiers up in their homes and feeding them and taking form there. And then, of course, the Stamp Act, which was an external tax, a tax placed on all sorts of paper documents and goods the colonials will use. This leads then to what we can call, what the colonials would, and the imperials would have called, the big question. And the big question is, no one is exactly really sure who has authority over the colonial economy. The colonists argue that you're making decisions for us that ought to be made locally, like they used to be made. And England says, well, no, you're part of this big major empire. We have the right and we've got the obligation to make certain decisions for you and certainly have you pay your fair share, do your fair part. This is the big theoretical question which is going to be engaged in for the next 13, 14, 15 years up to the Great Break, up to the Great Division. What's the colonial reaction? England did not anticipate this reaction. England had no idea the colonials would react they didn't know they were causing such an uproar by establishing these laws. The colonials begin to protest. They see this outside taxation as both unfair and illegal. And you begin to have not just protest, but disobedience. Something different than smuggling, something different than cheating across an invisible line. You begin to have physical coercion. You have the Stamp Act Congress, where for the first time, colonials come together and begin to meet to discuss what to do about this act. And one of their answers is to protest it. Another answer is to not purchase English goods. If you don't purchase the goods, you don't pay the tax. So you've got those kind of intellectual discussions going on at the same time that you've got a far, cruder, rougher system going on with the establishment of the Sons of Liberty by the likes of Samuel Adams. And you start to have this notion being set up of Sons of Liberty were pulling themselves towards mob action. You start to have groups of working class individuals burning down tax collectors' homes, bringing coercion on people, destroying stamps so they can get their hands on them, making it possible that the tax cannot be paid in the first place. This is disobedience. This is civil disobedience on a large scale. And so you have England in the position of, we pass these laws to generate revenue, particularly the stamp tax. We're not getting any revenue. So what does England do? They ultimately, since it's a failed policy, they cancel it. They repeal the stamp tax, which winds up setting, in England's point of view, a dangerous precedent. Because what happened here? There was an unpopular, unfavorable law among colonial subjects. Colonial subjects made trouble. The law went away. Everything happens for a reason, right? England can see that this could be a dangerous precedent for more disregarding of imperial authority, more than it's already happening with smuggling and violating the proclamation line. So England, on the same day they canceled the stamp tax, they passed what is called the Declaratory Act, which says that Parliament has the right and duty to make all laws for the colonies in every case whatsoever. In other words, it's Parliament in law saying that we have the right to make all absolute decisions for you. It just so happens the first rule we're going to make is to give you exactly what you want and get rid of the stamp tax. So when it comes to the lesson learned, think about what the colonials learned from this. The colonials made noise over something that was painful and unpopular, and it disappeared and went away. And the British tacked on that P.S., by the way, we get to make all your rules from here on out. The lesson the colonials learned is they paid attention to the first part. That second part about England making all their rules, didn't quite hear that so much. And that was not the part of the lesson that was internalized. So there's some dangerous patterns being set in, even though the colonists are not anxious to break away from England, not in the least. They're anxious to throw off English regulations, which they see as being unnatural, wrong, and not right for them. But it's going to be almost like if you take an angle like with a protractor, back at the point where the two lines intersect, it's a very small angle, but you stretch that angle out, stretch it out over time, through time, that angle begins to grow and it gets wider and wider and wider. This is the nature of the break. This is the nature of the Gulf with England. It's gradualist, it's small, it starts incremental, but we're going to see that schism, we're going to see that divide grow from a crack into a canyon. And that'll be a story for some of our lessons to come up that we pursue as we've laid down the road today on the first steps towards colonial crisis with the British Empire. We'll go much further and see this angle widen. Our lessons to follow.